in order for the queen to survive, she cannot view the system as traumatic,
Ever.
damaging, limiting, difficult, hurtful. She can't. She would crumble.
Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are excessively welcome to our conversation about one of the best episodes The Crown has ever put out. Season 5, Episode 8, entitled Gunpowder. I will say right up front that if you have never seen the movie V for Vendetta, stop our recap right now. Go watch that. And then you'll understand a lot more about Guy Fawkes Night. And yeah, here
It's a thing. It's a thing with a capital T.
It's a thing with a capital T. They did a great job of explaining it though in the show.
Yeah.
I thought. Like,
yeah, I loved the way they used like the exposition of William learning at Eton to like explain it, because like I'm sure there's a huge global audience that has no idea that this happens.
No. And then I didn't know it was called Bonfire Night when I first moved there. So like when I was watching everybody on the BBC, and they don't celebrate it in Northern Ireland. So I was like, which is ironic. Because you would think
land of the bonfires.
Land of bonfires. But the people that do bonfires in Northern Ireland do not want to overthrow Parliament. This is the weird.
It's a mess. It's a beautiful mess.
Guys, those four countries are just. Okay, so here's the summary falls to me, and if you guys are longtime viewers, you know that Erin is wonderful at details, and I am particularly good at sarcasm and big pictures. So, sarcastically big picture, this is where everything went tits up. And what this episode is the point of no return for the Windsor family. Very honestly. Both Charles and Diana, this is the point of no return from how the British public began to view Charles and the Queen and everything else. If you really trace a lot of modern beliefs about the monarchy back to the 90s, it's this interview people are talking about. Like, this is our monarch moment for this.
Yeah, it's an inflection point, 100%.
Our monarch moment for this interview is going to, for this episode, is going to be talking about how this interview is 100% Diana's trauma response. Because it was in a world in which human decency was a priority, this should have never happened. Like, this was a massive miscalculation that could only have been made by somebody who was manipulated into it and who was already traumatized and isolated. I will never say that she made, like, it's her fault for doing it or anything else, because, like, again, Martin Bashir played her like a fiddle. But there is no upside to this interview.
No.
There is just a lot of downsides. And I thought that the episode did an impeccable job of showing this bomb, this cultural and emotional bomb that went off, and some of its casualties. The only thing that happened in this episode that I didn't need to happen was the conversation with the chairman and his wife in their bedroom. I didn't particularly need it to take place in that location. But literally everything else about this episode I thought was tightly shot, really well written, very well produced and shot, and it was great. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I mean, like, how do you make something suspenseful that, like, most of the people watching, certainly in the UK, like, know the outcome?
Yeah.
Like, how do you make it interesting and keep people invested for 50 minutes for a story that is that impactful? I thought they did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, really, really great.
Yeah.
Basically, the whole thing is here. Obviously, it's Diana's Panorama interview. But what was more interesting to me is the bits about the internal stuff at the BBC over how they were going to do it. Were they even going to do it? And something that just really briefly for American folks watching this, the BBC is a corporation. And in the UK, that does not mean it is treated legally as an individual person like it is in the US. Corporations are attached... Corporations in the UK are opened by royal charter. And there are some exceptions to that now. There are some kind of ways around that now. But like certainly when the BBC was started, there was no... Like it still operates on a royal charter. Charles will have to renew its royal charter. William will eventually renew its royal charter. So they have a board of governors, like every corporation. But somebody on that board of governors is the liaison to the Queen. And that person is the chairman of the board. And then the director general does the actual running of the BBC.
Yeah.
The BBC is not allowed to make money.
No, it's publicly funded.
It's publicly funded. The parts of the BBC that do make money, Doctor Who, BBC America, Top Gear, all of those, are run by a completely different company that ironically is not a corporation, so that they can make money. The idea of not being a publicly funded thing, obviously, if you don't know, some pieces of this episode may have been very confusing to you. All this talk about ITV and Channel 4, which was the two privately funded, subscription-based things. It is as though, in Americans, all we had our entire lives were PBS. Mm-hmm. And then HBO came along. Mm-hmm. That is the closest thing I can use to explain. If you only had PBS and then all of a sudden HBO showed up.
Yeah, and you had... Your choices were publicly funded television or privately funded.
And you would have grown up with 5 BBC channels that everybody cycled through every night. 5 channels. And then if you could maybe cycle to... I mean, they say that this whole thing is like there's hundreds of channels. There are, but they're mostly beaming in ones from all over the world. So the other thing is that this really helped the diaspora because they were directly beaming in Indian channels and directly beaming in Bangladeshi channels. But with a basic satellite, like a bunny ear satellite still in the UK, you can get like 15 channels for pretty cheap or free. So the system works differently over there.
If you buy a TV license, which you do have to do.
You have to do.
It's like 44 channels or something.
Yeah.
You get with the TV license. But yeah, I mean, the reason Channel 4 is called Channel 4 is because it was literally the 4th channel. Mm-hmm. Like, it was like BBC 1, 2, and 3, and then Channel 4 was the 4th one. So, like, that, and, you know, then there's multiple ITVs, and there's Channel 5, and sort of pluses, and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a very, very different television system than we have here. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad you took a few minutes to explain it to certainly our American viewers, because I totally forgot. You and I lived there, so we like understand it. But yeah, it's, if you don't understand how that works, some of this stuff won't make sense. But I think the universality of it is that they are, you know, the early to mid 90s was when television news changed globally, and it was this huge like fear of, you know, the mass availability of channels and information and satellite TV and all this kind of stuff. So it happened specifically in a specific way within the UK because of the way their system works. But, you know, we had similar mass changes happening to American television as well. So it is both universal and specific in this case. And just, too, as well, to bring a little bit of television history back, like, when they're talking about interviews in particular of this kind, which Panorama historically did not do, and still kind of doesn't, these kind of, like, expose, one person only, that was the purview of Barbara Walters and Oprah Winfrey. That's it.
Those is who did those kind of interviews that were in any way salacious or anything else like that. The person that does them in the UK, I think, had not really risen to power yet, because that's Paxton, and I think he was on Channel 4, and that was a little bit later. I think Paxman was later.
I don't know.
But when they keep talking about, do you want to lose them to CBS? They're talking about Oprah. Do you want to lose them to ABC? They're talking about Barbara Walters. And so it was a real thing, too, that a dude did this interview. It was a real thing that a not white person did this interview. There was a lot of, like, and Martin Bashir had the right accent. Trust me, they wouldn't have entrusted this to somebody who sounded like they're Cockney. There is a BBC accent.
Yeah, or who sounded like they were Indian, you know?
Or was from Scotland. Like, this would not have been entrusted to somebody who didn't have the BBC accent.
Sorry, Pakistani. He's Pakistani. I apologize. But yes, he had the right cultural accent for sure.
So there was a lot of other, like, I just want to point out those tiny little things that folks may not have automatically filled in their brain. I now would like to talk about, overall, I want to talk about Dookie.
Yep.
In the grand tradition of really rich British people having terrible nicknames. I want to talk about Martin Bashir. And I want to talk about the quote that you found in the Variety from Dan What's His Nuts. So where would you like to start? Do you have a preference?
I don't think I do. I think let's start with Martin Bashir because he's the big kahuna, the big fish.
Okay, so Martin Bashir, in my public knowledge of being a human on the planet, is like only known for this.
Yeah, I mean, our British viewers can correct us if we're wrong, but I don't know him for anything beyond this.
Yeah. I am, as Aaron mentioned in the last episode, if you didn't join us for that one, there was a public inquiry about this whole situation in 2021. Found out that he is a big fat liar who lies. The BBC had to eat a whole hell of a lot of crow, as they should have, because this entire storyline, I just kept screaming, how has nobody fact checked this man? How has nobody, like, why did nobody ask to see, like, he literally, I just can't get over the fabricated financial statements. That, I don't think I will ever quite believe that happened. Because holy shit, how did that not get caught? Mm-hmm. And the answer is that they were so desperate because they had just lost Cheltenham, which is like, they had just lost the World Series to pay for play television. And I will also, just as a side, throughout our time there, the BBC lost other sporting things and other institutions. And let me tell you about the weeping and gnashing of teeth. So like, it's still, in like 2016, my husband was irate that like they lost, that some of the Formula One races were going to be on a channel he had to pay for.
Yeah.
So like, the fear, like, it's, the institutions are a thing, and when we get to Dookie, we'll talk about this institution. But like, you don't hear a lot of BBC or like reporters or anybody else who talk about like being out for the money and themselves as much as Martin did in these episodes. So like, I just wondered if he was a cultural fit, like, at all.
Yeah, and it's so weird that like, especially because Panorama was known for its like hard-hitting, investigative, like serious news coverage.
It was homework TV.
Yeah, and so like he wasn't even in a part of the BBC that like would have had that kind of culture, and so he had to do so much work. Like, how did he get there? Where did he come from? Why did he decide that like he was gonna turn Panorama into something that it had never been before and was never again? And like, why? So that he could be one of the most famous names on a byline for a TV interview? Great, but like the collateral damage could not have been worth it.
But I don't know if he faced any backlash until 2021. I actually don't know that.
I don't know that either.
And if he's not a royalist, collateral wouldn't be a word he would use.
I'm looking it up right now.
Literally.
Okay. We're going to see what it says. He's still alive. He worked for the BBC until 1999 on programs including Panorama before joining ITV. He presented the 2003 ITV documentary about Michael Jackson.
That's a must miss. Okay.
Ask me how much I want to hear that see that documentary. From 2014 2004 to 2016, he worked in New York, first as an anchor on ABC's Nightline, and then a political commentator on MSNBC, hosting his own program, Martin Bashir, and a correspondent for NBC's Dateline NBC.
Oh, he fits in so much better at primetime and Dateline than the BBC. Wow.
But like,
so he took this and got more jobs.
Clearly, there were no consequences. It launched his career.
Yeah. Yeah. He saw no downside to this. He was just going to get a career.
He resigned from his position at MSNBC in December 2013 after making ill-judged comments about the former governor of Alaska and vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. In 2016, he returned to the BBC as a religious affairs correspondent.
That explains so much about how the BBC handles religion. Okay.
In 2020, the BBC's Director General Tim Davie apologized to the brother of the princess, Earl Spencer, for Bashir's use of fake bank statements to secure his 1995 Panorama interview. Former Justice to the Supreme Court Lord Dyson conducted an independent inquiry into the issue and concluded that Bashir had commissioned fake statements, blah, 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 blah. Bashir resigned from the BBC in May 2021, citing health reasons. Y'all, he's fine.
Yeah, he's fine.
He
manipulated a mentally ill woman into blowing up the country. But he's fine.
Eleanor, I want you to put up the graphic that I'm going to give you that says, the meme that says, not all men, but definitely this fucking guy right now. Thank you.
Okay.
We're doing it live, folks. I mean, you're watching it like a week after we film it, but this is live that we're processing these emotions.
Okay. So
all right.
That leads actually really well into talking about Dookie, honestly.
Let's do it. Yes.
So obviously, this guy is like British with a capital B, right? He's like
the oldest of old school. Like,
he belongs to to a men's club, for crying out loud. Like, like he absolutely drinks only Marks and Spencer's tea. He has a sherry with dinner.
Mm-hmm.
The only time he makes merry is when there's a Christmas cracker involved. Like, this guy is an institution.
Yeah. In and of himself. Yeah.
Served in World War II, like, I mean. And I absolutely could have spent an entire, 9 hours with him. Because I found it so fascinating to spend time with somebody who, at their core, believes the following things. That Elizabeth is the country's mother. Mm-hmm. That their success as a country is inextricably tied to her. Mm-hmm. That the BBC is inextricably tied to her. And owes her for that situation. Mm-hmm. And that his job is to protect the public church, which is what they used to call the BBC. I kid you not. Like, that's what they used to call it.
Yeah.
And I am so glad they showed us the characters watching the interview.
Yeah.
Because the moment of Dookie crying,
mm-hmm.
like, Charles was always going to, stomp around, and Margaret was always going to be just a little bit like, oh, girl, I feel you. But, I needed somebody who believed in the BBC mm-hmm. to show me what it meant that the BBC took that interview.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that thing had been on ITV, it would have blown up their marriage. But it would have just been written off as somebody did it for money.
Yeah.
But because the BBC cannot make money, this was the public church calling out everyone's mom.
Yeah, and the conversation that Dookie has with John Burt, the Director General, when he goes to tell him that they're doing the show, or that they want to do the show, and this is when Dookie makes this whole argument. And he says that, like, the Crown and the BBC are intertwined, and you cannot have Great Britain without either of them. And so, if that is your worldview, and you see this interview, then you think it is the end of Great Britain.
Completely true. And we should also say it's slightly not hyperbolic, because even though he hasn't evolved, the BBC exists because of Elizabeth. Because the very first televised thing was her coronation.
Mm-hmm.
As the Queen Mother reminds us in this episode. But, like, that sounds hyperbolic to anybody who is under the age of 100. I respect. But, like, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
But he's also not, like, current.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was really, I mean, he just...
Yeah, and I think, like, it's such an important perspective to recognize. I mean, we're going through this kind of, like, globalized hand-wringing since 2016, and there's a lot of narratives about taking countries back to the glory days, the golden age, whatever. And I say 2016 because that's when the United States elected Donald Trump president, and that was very much his narrative, as also when the Brexit referendum happened. And that was a huge part of that narrative. Was also when Jair Bolsonaro entered the scene in Brazil, and that was very much his narrative, except he just kind of wanted to go back to dictatorship, but he still wanted to go back to, like, the better Brazil.
There was a lot of time travel desires in 2016.
It's the MAGA argument that is made. Like, we have to make America great again. We have to make Britain great again. We have to go back to this. And it's this, like, really kind of, like, grinding of gears of, like, global change and the people that aren't ready for what that global change look like and or threatened by it and or, you know. And so I'm really glad that they included it in this episode. In a way that was outside the, like, Brexit nonsense. Like, this was clearly way before it, which is important to show that, like, this was not a new idea that just, like, popped out of the global world in, like, 2016.
No, but I like, think the 90s was a lot about that for Britain, because the 90s is when everybody had to look at the monarchy, because we've got, you know, Fergie and Andrew all over the tabloids constantly, and they get divorced, and then we have the War of the Waleses, and they get divorced, and, like, all of this stuff. And it made me wonder, in the same way that, like, since 2016 in the United States, we've kind of, you know, been, a lot of us who study history and context will say, like, there was not a great America for everybody.
Right. No.
And but I also find it fascinating that in both Britain and England in particular, the good old days is, like, the 1950s. It's World War II. Mm-hmm. And so it's held on tightly to people who were, like, alive then or had been told stories about it or whatever. But just like in America, we learned that it wasn't great for everybody. I don't know if that lesson's been learned in Great Britain. Because there's still a lot of, like, the NHS was wonderful then, and trade unions were strong, and there's still a lot of, like, everything was wonderful. Like, y'all didn't have sugar for, like, 15 years. So, I'm not entirely sure, because Brexit has been such a damn failure in even just, like, feeding people now. Like, there has not been, to my knowledge, again, like, but I mean, I read The Guardian and The Times, like, almost every day. So I think I would have seen this kind of discourse of, like, that there was never a Britain. Mm. But I think one of the reasons that they can't have that discourse is that there was a Britain. It was the Queen on BBC.
Yeah. Yeah, and, you know, the idea, like, because it's not a concept that we have here, that there was a news channel that was as inextricably linked to the, like, you know, it would be the equivalent of, like, a direct relationship between the President of the United States and PBS. Like, in a way that it is so identified with each other. And, like, later when Dookie goes to apologize to the Queen and he says, like, he correlates, like, the fact that he doesn't recognize the corporation anymore with the fact that he doesn't recognize the world anymore.
Yep.
And so, you know, I think that's a really relatable position, and I think they did it with Dookie in a way that was respectful. It wasn't making fun of him. It wasn't, calling him a crazy doddering racist. He might be, we don't know. It's not our business in this position, but like I thought they did it in a way that was not respectful is not the right word, but empathetic. It came from a place of trying to understand him.
Like they treated him like a human. Like he wasn't a caricature. Like everybody in this episode was a human being. And that was really evident. The acting was top notch. All of that. Oh, you know what I didn't list is the scene between Diana and Lizzie. Which you found out was not factual.
Yeah, from our friends at Vulture. We'll link the recap in the show notes as per usual when we cite it specifically. But yeah, so when Diana, she stipulates throughout the episode that like she will do this interview if she gets to tell the Queen first. I'm not going to shit all over the firm without telling her. In real life, Diana did insist upon the Queen being told first. But Diana did not tell the Queen herself. She sent her private secretary. So that takes a little bit of the wind out of those sails. But it's one of the best acted scenes this show has produced. Again, I cannot get over the way Imelda Staunton has decided to embody emotion in Elizabeth in a way that Claire Foy and Olivia Colman did not do, which is like physicality and like literally muscularly, like clenching hands, shoulders, like all this kind of stuff that she's done to show that there is a human person inside there, even if she believes that human person's never allowed to come out. This was the scene that really, really, to me, brought to mind the Harry and Meghan of it all. And how many times they are telling their story. And how many times they are saying, we have to be the ones to tell our story. And, like, explicitly, Meghan says that in the Netflix series that they did. And I remember, like, looking at you being like, did they not tell it? Wasn't that the Oprah interview? And, like, that exact scene plays out in this episode where Lizzie says, like, explain to me how you haven't gotten your story out.
Which I think is somewhat of a trauma response, which is what we'll get into in the Monarch moment. Yeah. Because it's both infuriating, illogical, entirely emotional, and explainable. Which all feels 100%. Like a trauma response to me. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And, like... I think,
because there's a difference between having your story told and people believing it.
Yeah, totally.
And I think, like, that's the equivalency that, like, Meghan and Diana don't... It's like, if I just tell it enough, everyone will be on my side. It's not true.
Yeah, because we've seen, like, people just dig into their positions. They did it with Diana, and they're doing it with Harry and Meghan. Like, you've got the people that are, like, shouting all the revelations in Spare from the mountaintops, and you've got the Jeremy Clarksons who are doubling down on their racism and their hatred. So, like, people are just... I think it's just making people more entrenched on, like, which side they believe. Although, if y'all have statistics of, like, how many minds are being changed by... all of the interviews from Harry and Meghan, let us know. But I think that for me, one of the great, aside from that, how have you not told your story, was when the Queen, I think, legitimately believes that, like, she has defended Diana and that she wants her to be happy. And I think she believes that to be true. She just believes that it only if Diana found happiness within the system. And, like, that's the incongruity of their relationship, is that I don't think this version of the Queen, whether that's accurate or not, we don't know. The fictitious versions of the Queen did not want Diana to be miserable. Did not, like, this version of her did not hate her, did not spite her, was, like, frustrated with why she couldn't just, like, toe the line like everybody else. And I don't think Diana, at the core of herself, wanted to tear down the monarchy. But by the time she agreed to do this interview and did this interview and then had this conversation with the queen, it was too late to stop it. And like in her trauma response, she wanted to burn it to the ground.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote this scene is so heartbreaking because they both need to like this needs to be the Beauty and the Beast song. Like,
yeah,
barely even friends, and then somebody bends. Like, somebody needs to bend here. And neither one of them will. My frustration with Diana this entire series has been a complete and utter belief that she is always right. That she is the one who, like, knows what's best for her boys because this system is so monstrous. Like, she is the one. And I don't disagree, but also he's going to be king. Like, he's going to be king. Like, I don't understand what you don't understand here. And this could be that I am pragmatic. I was not raised in the family that she was raised in. I am not her. But like, and she could be completely different than what is being portrayed. My frustration with this character is that there is half a sentence in episode 9 where she takes a little bit of responsibility for her actions. Half a sentence. And the rest of the time, she doesn't understand why the entire country doesn't immediately want to burn the monarchy to the ground.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't ever pause to remember that this system, while it doesn't work for her, works for a lot of other people. It employs a lot of people. I do not believe the monarchy should exist. I don't believe it's worth the money the British taxpayers are paying. But overnight, to dismantle it like she wanted to do, we got to find these people some jobs. We got to move some money around. We got to sell some property. Like, this is a process, my sister. This is not a nuclear bomb. And she just wanted to tell her story and wake up and have everybody love her. Because it's a trauma response.
Yeah.
And so, like, Lizzie's real thing, though, is that she doesn't understand why any of this is a problem. So neither one of them ever sat down and asked a damn question.
Yeah.
They never sat down, because I do believe that Diana tried to reach out to the Queen, and I believe that the Queen was tired. Diana's a lot. And I think Lizzie was just like, I'm tired today. I can't handle this one more time hearing how terrible we are.
Yeah, and I think what you just said, it brought into my head, right? That, like, in order for the Queen to survive, she cannot view the system as traumatic.
Ever.
Damaging. Limiting. Difficult. Hurtful. She can't. She would crumble. So, like, I think that's the huge barrier between her. Diana only sees the system as traumatic. And Elizabeth can't.
And I think there, again, like, because of her trauma, Diana cannot consume anything in nuance.
Yeah.
I think there are probably beautiful things about being part of that family. I think because they're humans and, like, I'm sure the system, again, it works for some people or it wouldn't still exist. Like, systems that don't work at all do collapse. Like, hashtag Rome.
Their Guy Fawkes night looked nice. Looked like they had a good time as a family.
There's people that really adore going up to Scotland every Christmas. Like, just because you think it's ridiculous or it doesn't work for you doesn't mean it doesn't work. Yeah. And I think my other thing is, this is a bit of a spoiler for episode 9, in which I could go on a rant about Diana's view on marriage for a long, long time, because God love her. Whew, she was set up for failure from the jump. But, like, what she says something in episode 9 where, like, I didn't marry a family, I married a man.
Child.
My sweet summer child, you married a country.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not the country's fault that you didn't know what you were doing.
Yeah. And, like,
I mean, her life sounded shit. I'm not saying it wasn't. I think there's a lot of other people it wouldn't have been shit. Like, there's a couple times where I'm looking at this and been like, I would have had a lot more trouble than Kate apparently does. But, like, I could probably handle it at a different level than Diana does.
Yeah, and, like, so much of it is, how she was raised as well. And, like, God only knows when she emotionally arrested.
14. It really seems like around then.
She's very, very emotionally immature, very naive, very isolated, has been her whole life because she was introduced to Charles so young and got married so young. And she was sold a false bill of goods. She was sold that it was a romantic fairy tale. She believed that Charles believed it was a romantic fairy tale. And that's a hell of a lot of reality crashing into her life. But yeah, when she said that in episode 9, I was like, oh, girl. Oh, girl. And we will get to that scene in episode 9. Oh, don't you worry. But yeah, I mean, I think what I came to at the end of this episode was the phrase that you say all the time, hurt people, hurt people.
Yeah.
And Lord, was she a broken person.
And she wanted everything else to break. My closing comment is that this episode, like this interview, was not just countercultural for the firm, but for the entire country, because British people did not talk about their feelings in the 1990s.
No.
And I remember having a conversation with some friends of mine whose grandparents talked about watching the Panorama, and who like had to like get up and walk around the room because it was too many emotions.
Too emotional. Way too emotional.
And like one of their grandmothers like just made tea loudly in the kitchen during it because like they couldn't.
No, we don't talk about these things.
No. If you're curious as to why the country did not just embrace her, it was because she was the least British thing that had ever happened on their televisions, and yet she was the princess. So there's like two things that covered the newspapers. One is when she said there were 3 people in my marriage, which like that's gotta suck.
I can't imagine. I'm sure it really did.
Totally blow. So there were 3 people in my marriage, and then the fact that she said that Charles wasn't fit to be king didn't actually hang out that long. It was just like an ether thing, that she wanted to be queens of people's hearts, which is why this is when the term the people's princess really took off. Mm-hmm. And like that's why it's on her tomb and like everything else. They said, okay, you want to be the queen of our hearts. There was a little bit of a time where like everyone's like, screw you. But then when she started visiting AIDS patients, when she started doing her work with the landmines, when she started doing all of that, which like there's 2 years, I think, in between these two things. But those last 2 years, people really did embrace her. So those are that kind of the thing. But like that night was not a good night for anyone but Martin Bashir.
Clearly landed on his feet. Yeah, and like the quote from that I got from Vulture that I wanted to bring in here. And like, you know, when John Burt, who's the director general, is like of 2 minds about whether to agree to this, he does recognize that she is in a state. And he says, you know, we will be giving a platform to a very hurt, very unstable woman who clearly wants to inflict significant damage on the monarchy. So he knew it, and he decided to do it anyway. And then in the Vulture article, they were talking about the investigation and the independent inquiry. And John Burt said last year, so in the year of our Lord 2021, I believe, because the article is from last year, he described the episode as one of the biggest crimes in the history of broadcasting.
I would agree. It's up there.
And they don't have the time in this show to get into all of the context that we just got into over why it was. I mean, they kind of showed that it was a big deal, and it was, but, like, they have other stories to tell. And I'm not saying they should have done episode 9 entirely about the fallout. But, yeah, to me, that's the most upsetting thing about it, is that it should have never happened. It was entirely irresponsible and abusive and despicable. And, yeah... I hope the Spencer family sues Martin Bashir for all he's worth.
Yeah, because you can tie a pretty... You can make the argument that this is one of the things that contributed to her death, for sure. So have fun.
Yeah.
Because this is what broke it so badly that they wouldn't pay for security forces, I'm sure.
One of the things, yeah. I'm sure. It all leads down to it. And you can certainly make... I would imagine legal arguments for like libel or slander or, you know, I don't know, wrongful damages. I don't know. They'll find a reason. Find a reason, Earl Spencer, please. because
I don't
would
know if you
just
have
like
anything
to-
else going on. So like,
I don't
here's a
know
good
if you're
hobby.
busy. But I hope that's what comes next from this story, because I am not necessarily always a spiteful person. But I would like to see Mark Bashir face some consequences from this besides just having to resign from his cushy BBC job.
Agreed.
Thanks, Internet. Get on that.
So speaking of trauma, as we always do on this channel, we'll be talking about Diana's and then the trauma that she inflicted on Charles and her children, because this was a trauma response from her, and kind of what that looks like in our Monarch moment. So if you are not on our Patreon, links below, make sure to join us for our Monarch moment. Next up in the playlist will be our conversation about episode 9, Couple 31. And as always, we have thoughts and feelings. So do not miss the opportunity to join us for that. And we will see you then. Bye.
Bye.